I'm not a big proponent of conspiracy theories, as you know if you've watched my past videos, but the amazing thing to me is that the people who do focus on conspiracy theories a lot always seem to focus on the least provable ones, and they also never seem to try to gain a bigger picture of what's going on through these conspiracy theories. I do think it's useful to look at unrecognized information and try to piece together a better picture of how our government and how the establishment works, though. So the first thing I'm going to do is throw out almost all of the conspiracy theories which occurred during the Cold War. Some of them have very good evidence, but those can kind of be excused in the context of the Cold War, maybe. And secondly, I'm going to focus on the conspiracy theories that have extremely good evidence that are usually almost proven. I'm only going to pull out one instance from the Cold War, and that's because it's basically proven and shows the extent to which our establishment will go. That's Operation Northwoods, where the Joint Chiefs of Staff approved and recommended false flag operation in the United States, basically a terror operation which was going to hijack airplanes, conduct other terrorist activity, kill Americans in order to provoke a war with Cuba. Not really a conspiracy theory, it's a proven, accepted fact of history, and it was only President Kennedy and Secretary of State McNamara which stopped Operation Northwoods from going forward after it had been approved by the Joint Chiefs of Staff. Only really important historically because a lot of people think that the United States establishment and government would never conduct a agent provocateur type of operation that killed Americans on our own soil, and yet it's accepted that the Joint Chiefs of Staff did approve that kind of thing in the past. Next, look at the 1993 bombing of the World Trade Centers. One that came much closer to succeeding than people recognize, almost brought down one of the Twin Towers, supposedly. What was never really reported was that the FBI had a plant within the terror group, and it was an outside plant also, so they could be almost certain of his loyalty. And that FBI plant was possibly the one who initiated the attack, but certainly he was making reports back to the FBI on a constant basis, this is accepted, and telling them that an attack was about to occur, and the FBI simply allowed it to go forward. The only reason we know this is that the plant, who was an Egyptian army officer working for the FBI, had a feeling he might be double-crossed, and so he started recording his conversations with the FBI, and so the whole thing couldn't be covered up. But basically proven that the FBI and establishment knew that this attack was going to occur. They had no reason not to trust their own outside plant, who was an Egyptian army officer. There's also a lot of evidence that the CIA and the establishment allowed the terrorists to come into the United States, but since that's not absolutely proven, I won't really go into that one. I'm also going to skip over the entire September 11th, 2001 attack on the World Trade Centers in the Pentagon because, again, although there's a lot of intriguing evidence of government foreknowledge and perhaps government involvement, the evidence is much stronger for the Anthrax attack, and it proves the same thing, that the government was an agent provocateur in order to initiate a false war on terror. So I'm going to have to go over some of these instances kind of briefly, otherwise this video is going to last forever because there are a lot of them. So as I mentioned with the Anthrax attack, it was originally blamed on terrorists, and then a few scientists started pioneering techniques to prove where the anthrax came from, and they proved that this strain of anthrax could have only come from a government lab. And the anthrax which was used against the congressmen who were holding up adoption of the Patriot Act, that was weaponized anthrax, which would have been an extremely short list of secret government institutions that came from. Congress was, of course, interested to pursue this investigation very carefully since they had been attacked, along with the general public. The FBI claimed that even Congress wouldn't be given any information or any continuing updates on the investigation under the guise of national security. What is known, it slipped out, was that Dick Cheney and his immediate staff had been taking Cipro in preparation for an anthrax attack weeks before the anthrax attack occurred. So the things that can be absolutely proven are that Dick Cheney and his staff were preparing for a potential anthrax attack and that the anthrax did come from a government lab. Sadly, the one key scientist who was pioneering the effort to determine specifically which government lab the anthrax came from, that scientist was eventually targeted by the government as being the one responsible for the attack. First, they tried to target a different scientist who put up an ironclad defense, so then they targeted this second scientist who eventually either committed suicide or was killed. Also, after scientists began to develop techniques that could have shown exactly which government lab the anthrax came from, the government destroyed the entire database of anthrax samples so that no one could prove specifically which lab it came from. These three instances, Operation Northwoods, the 1993 World Trade Center attack, and the 2001 anthrax attack, they show extremely strong evidence that the American government, a faction in control of the American government, is willing to carry out terror operations against U.S. citizens and even against members of Congress in order to provoke false wars. Next is something even more disturbing, which is more or less proven, that the U.S. establishment, in collusion with a faction of the government, carries out these wars with the foreknowledge that they're false for the pure motive of profit. The attack on Iraq, for example, it was now proven that there were no weapons of mass destruction, but it's also proven, if you look into the information, that the claims of any Al-Qaeda Saddam link and the claims of any weapons of mass destruction in Iraq were laughably trumped up. The one or two questionable agents who are being paid by the U.S. government to provide these ridiculous stories, Agent Curveball and one other, if you look into it, you can see that everyone knew that these were lies, and it was just a trumped up story to make an excuse for an attack on Iraq. Hans Blix, the lead UN inspector, was very clear at the time in saying that Iraq had no weapons of mass destruction. There was never a Al-Qaeda Saddam link. It's also proven and undisputed that a few government agents, members of the intelligence community, tried to tell the truth and stop the lies from being spread, people like Joseph Wilson and Susan Lindauer, but that the U.S. government specifically and illegally targeted them and put their lives and their families in danger in order to silence them. Because it's worse than almost any other conspiracy theory out there, and it's not even disputed, that the United States government and establishment were willing to murder thousands of soldiers and hundreds of thousands of Iraqis for profit. And the one excuse that you occasionally hear is that, well, if the United States didn't dominate these countries in the Middle East, someone else would move in to fill the void. But if you look at the reality of the few, very few, independent countries in the Middle East in recent history, those countries were not dominated by Russia or China, for example. They were able to maintain a degree of autonomy, a relatively decent autonomy. So it's a pleasant lie to tell that the United States has to dominate the Middle East. First of all, it's not a good ethical argument, and secondly, it's not true based on the reality that you can observe. So although these specific examples are never discussed in this way, and much more tenuous conspiracy theories get all the play on the internet and the search engines, I think these examples show overwhelming evidence, in much better than any other conspiracies being discussed. They show that the United States establishment is willing to conduct false flag terror operations in the United States in order to induce war hysteria, in order to pursue large-scale wars which kill hundreds of thousands of people purely for profit. Okay, people may say, that was the Bush administration. We accept that they were bad, but these ongoing terrible things couldn't possibly be policies of the United States government and establishment in other administrations. Well, first of all, the 1993 attack on the World Trade Center was technically under Clinton. But let me give a different example that's, again, accepted and proven. Operation Gunwalker, which started under President Bush, and it broke as a terrible scandal, and the Bush administration said, we don't know how this could have possibly happened. It'll never happen again. And then the exact same thing continued under the Obama administration as Operation Fast and Furious. And again, the same scandal broke. And again, no one knew how it could have possibly happened. Well, it was an ongoing policy, a policy to allow the flow of arms into northern Mexico. There are a lot of reasons why many corrupt governments historically have tried to destabilize their neighbors, but basically it's to reverse the flow of cash from one country to another. When your neighbor is unstable, then the cash stops flowing from you to them, and it starts flowing from them to you as people flee the instability. Also, the United States government has had a history of favoring certain drug cartels over others, and I'll get into that in a minute. But look again at the, can only be called evil intent, the willingness to destabilize your neighboring country, to kill hundreds of people most likely, and terrorize thousands of people again purely for profit. And again, not disputed. It's not disputed that Operation Gunwalker occurred under the Bush administration, that they said it was a mistake, and then the exact same policy continued under the Obama administration as Operation Fast and Furious, and again the scandal broke, and again they claimed that it was a mistake. And I'd like to stress that when you look throughout history with governments that have amassed too much power and are no longer accountable to anyone, you see these kinds of examples again and again, and they're perfectly accepted. It just becomes hard for us to imagine that our own government has amassed so much power that they're unaccountable and doing things which can only be described as evil. You know, I've got several other examples here, and then I realized that I've already given enough examples. People are either going to believe this kind of thing or they're not. The future examples that I was going to go over are even more horrifying, and they just give people an excuse to block it out entirely. If you want to, you can look at the numerous reporters who have given up their careers and in one case their life to expose CIA involvement and large bank involvement in the drug trade and favoring certain drug cartels. You can look into the Franklin child abuse scandal, how the FBI was used as a tool for the establishment and powerful people in the government to shut down that investigation, how one of the alleged victims of child abuse was thrown in jail for 3 years in order to silence her and to silence the other people from coming forward, how the state investigator died under mysterious circumstances. But these things just become so terrible that people will block it out. We recognize historically that governments were involved in the drug trade when they became corrupt, and that corrupt people within the government who are completely unaccountable, like Roman emperors or European aristocracy, become sadistic and even start murdering and torturing children. But we just don't think it could possibly happen in the United States. And I don't claim that there's absolutely ironclad evidence of some of these, but there's certainly a lot more evidence than most of the conspiracy theories that get bandied about on the internet and have a lot of popularity. But my main purpose in making this video, particularly with the early examples, was just to open people's minds to an alternate view of our government and a more historically accurate view of what happens when governments become overly powerful and unaccountable. They always become extremely corrupt. So if you know someone or many people who are potentially open to taking an alternative view beyond what's pushed in the mainstream media, and yet they haven't necessarily heard good examples, or they perfectly reasonably tend to pick apart some conspiracy theories, forward this video to them and ask them to look into these specific examples. It will hopefully help them to get an alternative and more historically correct view of our government, and maybe lead them on the path of finding ways in which they can personally resist this kind of thing.